Hi, I'm Mark Montgomery. I'm a retired Navy Rear Admiral, and I currently run the Cyberspace Solarium Commission for the U.S. Congress. The way I got into operational design was I was both a lead planner at the United States European Command, or Command for Planning for Possible Crisis or Conflicts with Russia, and our U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. I was the head of operations, so I was responsible for how we looked at operational planning for a crisis or conflict in North Korea, or kind of most dangerously, a crisis or conflict with China. And in looking and being introduced to the challenges we had, I started to realize that just the normal planning tools that were available to a senior leader weren't sufficient. You had to step back and look at the design that you were trying to achieve, or the objectives you were trying to achieve. And operational design became a good tool to frame the environment you're in, to think about the problems you had, and then to design a successful operational and strategic approach to deal with the contingency or crisis you were facing. I think whenever you think about major conflict with a foreign, with another power, you think about whether or not that country has nuclear weapons. And then so one of the challenges we had to do with is there going to be a significant restraint on our ability to impose costs on that country because they have nuclear weapons, and you would get yourself into escalation management very quickly. In other words, the potential for nuclear exchange. So you then had to think, well, if I have that constraint, what are other tools I can use to impress on the adversary, to attempt to deter the adversary, or if I can't deter the adversary, defeat their war aims during a crisis or conflict. And so for me, and in both the case of Russia and China, that's a very strong limitation for the United States and its allies and partners, who are generally democracies, who generally are looking for a non-escalatory approach to crisis management. So that was an issue you have to put through kind of a design game to figure out what are ways I can get around this conundrum of escalation and avoid having to use, the term of art would be like a mainland strike. It is easy to default to your career-long expertise. It's very easy for a military officer to default to military kinetic solutions. It's easy for a naval officer to default to maritime solutions. We each come from a well-trained, something we're probably pretty good at, background to have gotten to the rank we're at. But I think what you have to do is you have to, shed those kind of preconceptions about what a known solution is, and start thinking about the known unknowns. Like, we understand there's an economic implication to this. We understand there's a diplomatic and an informational. We don't have the real the specifics on what the operational environment of that is, or the operational benefits it brings. So digging into that brings it back over. One other thing I'd mention is thinking about how the adversary looks at the issue. One of the issues design, I felt, did was sometimes help you frame the issue from the adversary's point of view. And that can teach you a lot about what can deter someone, to basically sit in their shoes for a period of time and think about the problem from their viewpoint. That could easily teach you a great deal about how to impact the decision-making of that adversary by having suffered through the challenges from their perspective. And so I think that's an important part of design too, is kind of when you flip the table and think about it from the other point of view. Your planning team should be out there working in the expanse. I think you need to be getting a much more refined set of actually executable solutions. So, you do have to be careful. You're absolutely right that we don't have the time, the kind of decision-making jobs that as you become more senior, you're sitting in, you really don't have time to explore the whole design scenario, and you don't have time to enmesh yourself in all the different options. Instead, you have to have people you trust, and people whose decision making you value come back to you with a much more refined set of decisions to make. And so I think that's a good bit of, it's a good bit of caution to make sure that, you have the right trusted workforce out there, operational planners out there working on this, and they bring it back to you for you to kind of look at a more refined decision set. To me, the value in the design planning is the type of options that are available to the crisis management planner. By the time you get to crisis management, you only have a few minutes. That's fine because you've already worked through the situation. If you're going to be attacked by aliens and we've never thought about planning for aliens, sure. I mean, I wish I could wind the clock back and say, hey, one more thing to study, an invasion by aliens. But for most operational planners, we understand, what the future threat environment looks like. I mean, you have to know who your future adversaries or future challenges in a non-military context might be. And you have to do the planning for that ahead of time and the design work for that ahead of time. If someone comes to me and says, I only have, 36 hours or 24 hours or 12 hours to work on this very complex problem, and we didn't do any operational design, what do? I'd say, well, do your best planning, take what you have off the shelf that matches it the best and get to work on refining it. There's not a magic button for doing design in 6 or 12 hours. When I was Navy, I was really a Pacific planner or a European planner or a Central Command planner. It was more the Pacific planning. I just think it's the design there. There's so many more alternatives and options. So when you think about dealing with an adversary, a potential adversary like China, there's the economic element is such a strong, it's such a wide-ranging basket of tools that can be used in there. Same with the diplomatic and with the information operation. So I just think there was more in there beyond just the military. I think in cyber, there's a lot of innovation to be done. I don't think I've come across a operationally experienced, like a J35 experienced cyber planner who's had a significant amount of design education. I'm sure those people are being created as we speak in several of our countries and in the United States and in Canada and other NATO countries and probably in China and Russia as well. But I mean, I just had not seen that yet. Doesn't mean there isn't a unicorn out there that doesn't exist, that exists, but I believe that we're still at the very front end of how we integrate cyber planning into our broader military operational planning. Whereas in the thinking about a traditional campaign with China or Russia, I think there's been a lot of work, decades worth of work done. I think the whole idea behind design is to get an understanding of the other tools that are available. I would describe it as a victory if a Navy officer came up with an economic solution to a challenge with Russia or China or some third-party state. And one thing I mentioned about design is the power of bringing in allies, because when you talk about a non-standard answer, there are many things that for a Canadian planner, for example, where the U.S. military might bring in some capability or capacities. And there's some things where the Canadian military might bring in a capability or capacity, say in the Arctic particularly, that for the United States planner. But well beyond that are those non-military tools for national security, the economic, law enforcement, diplomatic, informational, they're out there. Now there's going to be a much greater variance between allies and partners, among allies and partners. And that variance gives you options, and that options gives you revelations, and those revelations give you success, right? So from my point of view, one of the real advantages of design planning is when you begin to do it amongst allies, because you really expand the opportunity for determining a more effective decision.